the one thing that we all have in common is that we all read English here at Oxford. And obviously you've come on an extraordinary journey. Looking back now to your time at Oxford, have you wound up somewhere you thought you might get to, or has it all been one stage at a time and evolved naturally? What did you want to do when you left?
Oh, I graduated in 1980 and there was a recession, so I don't think I had any particular... I didn't know what the target was. Certainly working in the theatre, if I'd known then that I was going to end up working in the theatre, I would have been very, very happy. But at the time, I thought I was going to go off and do a postgraduate in film at UEA, and that was a very, very depressing thought, particularly after I'd visited it.
No, that's fair. And what are your academic memories of being at Oxford? What particular lecturers or tutors you had that you look back on now after a life in the theatre and think were major influences, perhaps?
It was unusual at Merton because there were just 4 of us a year doing English, and we had John Jones, who himself had an unusual trajectory. He'd started as a law don and then become the classics don, and then became the English don, with just 1 law degree, and he taught in a very kind of intense way. And he didn't mind if you didn't write an essay for a couple of weeks, but of course it then had to be very, very good. So my memory is wonderful late afternoon, early evening tutorials with a glass of sherry, feeling vaguely inadequate, and very occasionally feeling exhilarated that something had clicked.
Well, that's brilliant. And did any of your contemporaries go off into the theatre, or did they all make their way to the city or teaching? Or?
Yeah, sort of a range of things, really. Mark Thompson, who went on to be Director General of the BBC, was in the year above. But other than that, it was pretty broad spread, I think.
And so after leaving Oxford and deciding not to go to UEA, what was the next move in your path? It
was very unplanned. I stuck around Oxford, and I taught for picked up a tutorial, a crammer, and I started teaching general and communication studies at the Oxford College of Further Education. And I was sort of getting on my moped and going up the Cowley Road and teaching gas fitters and British Telecom engineers. They were the creme de la creme. And so on.
Well paid, presumably.
They were pretty well paid, exactly. Yeah, and they were actually kind of quite interested. Everybody else was just kind of getting through it, really. So that was quite tough. And then I started looking around, and then I had a very good thing happen to me, which is that I went to see a play at the Half Moon Theatre in Stepney in the East End, and thought this is the most wonderful place. So I asked them if they wanted somebody to come and sort of sweep the stage for a summer, and they took me on, and that's how I started getting into the professional theatre.
Can you remember the play that you saw?
I saw a play called WCPC with Robert Stevens. And I saw a rare performance where Robert Stevens actually appeared on stage. He was quite indisposed often.
Well lubricated.
Yeah.
Who was running the Half Moon at that time?
I can't remember.
Okay, sorry.
It'll come back to me. Yeah.
And then after the Half Moon, where did life take you after the Half Moon?
Again, this was pretty random. I had, through a friend, I knew somebody in the press office at the National Theatre, and I happened to be there, and she said, "Oh, I'm about to leave my job, so I'll get you an interview." And that's how it worked. So I got an interview for the press office at the National Theatre, and that's how I got in.
Oh,
and Peter Hall was in his final year, and Richard Eyre was coming in, so it was quite interesting to be in the press office at that time.
Yeah, no, that was very much a sort of a changing of the guard, I guess. And how did you move from the press office up towards the top floor and the office beside the artistic director? How did that work?
I went to talk to the then executive director David Orkin, and he was very, very good. I didn't explain why I wanted to go and meet him, and he just allowed me to go and sit on his sofa, and I said, it's absolutely marvellous. I love the National Theatre. I've got a feeling I'm going to run out of interest in doing press. And he said, is there anything else you want to do? And I told him the one job that I wanted to do in the National Theatre was to be responsible for the planning of the repertoire. And he said, well, funny you should say that. I think it might come up, but you might have to wait for 6 months. So I waited, and it duly came to me.
How long had you been press officer at that time? How long had you done that one?
2 years, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I suppose writing those press releases was second nature to a man who'd written long essays to put in front of John Jones.
It was enjoyable. It was enjoyable. Yeah. And the press office it had been run by somebody who Peter Hall had made an associate of the National Theatre. That's the regard with which he held this guy, John Goodwin, who he attributed the getting the RSC a London base. And Peter was absolutely brilliant at kind of spin, as was John. And they did it at very, very high calibre. It was very interesting. I've rarely seen it done. And that was a really interesting experience to see the way in which they played the press.
Interesting, because a lot of those early advertising sort of slogans, I mean, Salman Rushdie takes credit for go to work on an egg, but there are a lot of, early advertising sort of PR phrases and things from that period that sort of stick in the mind, really, and maybe the influence of Oxford English literature was felt in terms of the succinct but memorable phrases. And from there, obviously, Richard Eyre's period. What do you remember most strongly, production-wise, from Richard Eyre's period?
Well, I think Tom Stoppard's most brilliant play, Arcadia.
Right.
And the premiere of Angels in America.
Gosh.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
That's extraordinary.
So I think...
Which came back 2 directors later.
Correct. Yeah.
I've just worked on this play. I wonder if you remember this, David Story's The March on Russia.
Yeah.
Just worked on the autumn. It was Eyre's second season, wasn't it? But long enough ago that I don't often meet people who saw it. And the story I loved was that, because it was the cast of In Celebration, have I got that right? Yes. Effectively, I mean, Bill Owen and Constance Chapman returning. And so this sense of ensemble was quite ingrained with Lindsay Anderson's song.
That's right.
And the story Paul Miller told me was that they used to sit and have a cup of tea on stage at the end as the audience left, which I thought was really great, as if they'd been invited to tea, and then they carried on. I don't know whether that's true or not, though, or whether that's a one-off Paul thing.
Yeah, okay. But actually Paul would know, so...
Yeah.
So, yeah, I
might
can
be
believe
true.
it. Yeah.
And when did you first meet Nick Heitner?
In his first production for the National Theatre, which was, I think, in 1989, which was Ghetto, a play by Joshua Sobol. And I was its publicist. And I remember being struck by how unbelievably focused and good with his time. And so I was sort of hovering around, needed to talk to him about some independent interview or piece he was writing. And the tech was due to end at 1. And then he ended the tech session, he turned around to me, and he just engaged completely. I'd rarely come across that ability to switch focus so effectively. And I thought, wow, this guy's really, really good.
He's got something.
Yeah, and he was a very good director as well.
Yeah, no, very good director. Did you get to see him much in rehearsal? Because that's always fascinated me in terms of the rehearsal. Because you've obviously seen a number of directors in rehearsal, and you must have seen some very different styles. Could you perhaps compare and contrast some of them? You don't have to mention names.
I think there are... Yes, it's very interesting, particularly comparing people's personality with what they might be like in the rehearsal room. But I'm picking this up. I haven't actually seen that many people. I haven't sat in many rehearsals. I've watched it at sort of late stage, and particularly the run-throughs and so on. I think what I can infer about Nick's style is that he manages to engender a feeling of sort of agency amongst the actors. Having said which way, if there were a binary choice, we talk about, sort of, there are two ways of doing this play. Is it going to be red or is it going to be blue? So he starts out at the beginning. I watched him do that. He starts out at the beginning by saying, look, there are two ways to go here, or three ways to go, and this is the way we're going to go. And then he reminds people through the process that that is the way people are going. So they have quite considerable amount of freedom. And if you read his book, he's fascinating, particularly about directing Shakespeare, I think, in the way in which the actors will bring a lot. I mean, he talks about Claire Higgins playing Gertrude in his production of Hamlet. And he credits her with the idea that she does actually see the ghost. She sees it too. So I think he gives people a lot of license within a clearly defined direction of travel. And I think the other thing that is characteristic of Nick's work is whenever is the obvious sense of affability you often get on stage, particularly in comedies.
One of the things that has enormously impressed me during the time that you and Nick were in charge together at the National was the extraordinary high standard of production across what at one point was 4 stages. And it seemed to me that between you were very effective at intervening where necessary to perhaps rescue or change a production at a late stage. Is that a fair comment?
Thank you. I probably should fend off the compliment because I'm not sure. I can think of one particular example which he did get very involved in, which was Warhorse.
Right.
Which was not destined to be a huge hit. It had an unusually long preview period, and he stepped in twice during that preview period. And I was very much encouraged him to risk what could have been his friendship with Tom and Marianne, the directors, in order to get them back onto some kind of track. And I think that was an unusual thing for the director of National Theatre to be quite so interventionist, and they were very grateful for it. But I think otherwise, what we tried to do was to try and ask ourselves the question, what kind of production, in inviting this director and as the project is coming together, particularly the key decision of the director, what kind of production are we imagining? Not to guess what it would be like, but if there are some basic choices you're making, aesthetic choices you're making by asking a particular director to do a particular play, then it's possible to imagine what the resources the production will need and what kind of support it will need. And I think we got quite good at being at sort of defining that.
And also an extraordinary record of bringing in productions from the outside and associates and getting Helen Mirren back into the theatre after well into her film career. What's been the secret of your success in getting that extraordinary range of talent involved? Because obviously, Nick's directing, you're having to go out and talk to people.
Well, I think it's probably pretty simple, actually. I think it's, and this is much more Nick than it is me. It's having the nous to think about when you might want to do, how far in advance you might want to do a Shakespeare, or in the case of Helen, coming back to do the Racine. And just having the confidence that the rest of the repertoire can be organised around that. And that's the kind of the key to the planning of the National Theatre repertoire. You're composing it as a picture which is yet to form, and you're putting in some major strokes. You're not knitting it row by row.
But, this was an extraordinary period, and what I always loved about the period that the two of you were running it was the way that you constantly brought in classical theatre, Elizabethan Jacobean drama, reworked with often young directors, but that wonderful blend of the sort of contemporary and the classical. and even children's theatre later on in your period there. How far in advance were you planning these? And obviously you cast your net quite widely internationally. So how did you set about getting that sort of array of talent from domestically and internationally?
I'd say probably the planning horizon at its most distance was about 18 months hence, with a sense of and one choice begets others, and something becomes a tentpole around which you'll organise stuff, either because it needs a particular playing pattern in the repertoire, or because it needs a particular kind of resource. But normally not more than 18 months out. And actually, you can go to an actor to ask them to play Hamlet or Othello, Iago, 18 months away, but most actors will not commit for other roles nearly as far out as that.
I first got involved with you and Nick sponsoring the National Theatre in a wonderful production of Dr. Seuss, and I just still think what a brave thing it was to put on a theatre performance really designed for 4 to 8-year-olds. Talk us through that, because it was an extraordinary thing to get permission from his widow to do the thing in the first place.
Yeah, that was... Well, I think the director, you remember, was Katie Mitchell.
Yeah.
And Katie's extraordinary precision and commitment to having made her choices. And so she was absolutely determined. The designer was Vicky Mortimer. Mm-hmm. It has very good sound by Gareth Fry, as I remember.
Wonderful.
And the whole thing had to be as close to the books as possible. And that was an unusual commitment of time and energy for that age group. But I think that felt like a very good thing to do.
It was wonderful, and having all the space for the young people to go and lie on the floor at the front and lie on top of cushions and pillows. I think that was an extraordinary commitment to the people in the future. And then that wonderful production she followed up with Beauty and the Beast, with the 2 naughty fairies at the front, which she added on to give a sort of focus for the children. I mean, that was another wonderful production for children.
Yes, I think that's that sense that you could produce at the highest calibre for very, very young people. I mean, I think that was a particular belief that Katie had. And very often is the case when directors have children of certain ages that it comes to the moment where they want to direct stuff for the kids, essentially. In fact, we're having this conversation at the moment with Simon McBurney, who hasn't ever, as far as I know, done a show. But you think his ability to produce spectacle and storytelling would be extraordinary.
But it was extraordinary listening to Katie Mitchell, because she said to me, I did that production for my daughter. She'd never seen any of my work before. That was for her. That was the first time she saw what I did. And she said, it was in her words, a sort of a big step away from the slightly doomy sort of stuff that she normally did. But it was wonderful theatre, and I think and gave you and Nick the confidence to schedule in more children's shows which continue, which I think was remarkable. Tell us about The Shed, because for me that was one of the most exciting things that happened on the London theatre scene ever.
Well, just to explain where it came from, which obviously you know well, it came from a need to give ourselves a third space while we were closing the Cotslow. We had to close the Cotslow because its seating system was breaking down, but we decided we would cure a whole lot of problems in the Cotslow at the same time. And we thought it would also be exciting to give ourselves a more sort of fringe venue for a limited period of time. And it was kind of important that it couldn't be a permanent addition to the National Theatre. And I think really Nick and I I think Rufus and Lisa, our successors at the National Theatre, who definitely wanted to keep it for longer and did keep it for longer, might feel differently about that. But we were very keen that it should only exist for a certain amount of time. And it was a 225-seat temporary theatre designed by Steve Tompkins, which sat as if it just sat on the square outside the National Theatre. Actually, it was cleverly stitched in. It had its main beams went down into the car park, and then it borrowed the National Theatre's heating and cooling, and it was naturally ventilated, and we used the dressing rooms. And I think it did serve a purpose in allowing more risk-taking and encourage, and it certainly produced a different kind of audience and a certain kind of, more of a kind of relaxed form of programming.
Definitely, and I think the risk-taking in there, some of that was absolutely inspired. I always felt it gave people the chance to act, direct, or write a play sort of 5 or 10 years earlier. But it had a buzz to it, and as you say, you almost left the main body of the church and walked in, and there was that very sort of cool bar.
Yeah.
It just had a different sort of feel to it, didn't it?
Yeah, it's a very, I mean, I think it's a dilemma really for the National Theatre, which is, and I think it's one that, for instance, Trevor Nunn wrestled with. I think there is a danger that the National Theatre needs to represent all kind of playmaking, and I think it absolutely shouldn't. I think if it spreads itself too widely, then it ignores the existence of a very complicated and subtly composed British theatre scene. So I think the only danger with that, and possibly this is the explanation of why the shed needed to be temporary, which is the National Theatre has no business having a 200-seat theatre on a permanent basis, I think, because otherwise it starts trespassing on all sorts of other people's territory, which is very well occupied, places like the Bush or
Orange Tree,
or the Orange Tree, or indeed, I don't know whether you'd agree with that, Barney. I'm trying
really
not to use the
interesting
word ecology.
It's making me... So I'm always interested in asking people involved in programming repertoire, particularly when it's not new theatre buildings, where there is this simplicity of, if there's a script, then we'll do it. But that does raise the role and the question of what role the National Theatre played while you were doing that. So something I've been thinking about just listening to you there is, so much of programming for me seems to be about people and about, there's this line in Nick's book about wanting to see what Emma Rice could do with the Olivier, and that being the initiating point of her relationship there. But there is also this role which does come from the leadership of the theatre, which is also someone has to want to do a Shakespeare, someone has to want to do a show, a family show. Again, Nick talks about skipping a couple of steps by wanting to make a show for young audiences, and that being very advantageous because there was no one else asking to do The Wind in the Willows at that time, sort of thing, and the way that the National Theatre leads or curates or provokes public taste must have been quite a difficult thing to try and be in charge of.
Yes, I mean, I think that's very, very interesting question that you're pointing to there, which is, I think that it's important that I think that the National doesn't get into a policy where the policy is effectively success. I think this is going to sound perverse, but actually I think there are successful strategies that the National could adopt, which would undoubtedly lead to full houses and awards, which it shouldn't, because that's not what it's there for. I don't mean you understand that it should be there in order to be unsuccessful and unpopular.
Empty and yeah.
But I do think that everything comes at the cost of what you didn't do as a result. And I think that, for instance, Nick said right at the beginning, when we were first talking about his candidacy for the National Theatre, he said, I think it's very important that we should have a no famous plays policy in the Cottesloe, as it was then. Because if you give directors the chance to direct in a 300-seat theatre, they will want to do anything there, because in a way everything is easier, and potentially more enjoyable to the audience to see the actors that close up. So you do the classics there, you do the Shakespeares in the Cottesloe, and then it means that at best 30,000 people get to see those productions. And can that be right? That can't be right, can it?
So, and it encourages directors not to take on the bigger challenge.
Exactly that. If you give them the Cottesloe, then they won't step up to the Olivier and the Lofoten. And I think that was an enormously... First of all, I think it was a very penetrating insight, and I think it was very typically courageous of Nick to say, that's what I'm going to do. Because, you can imagine shed loads of awards weren't won by the productions that didn't happen, And I mean, and anyone, other directors of the National Theatre have had different ideas, but I think that was a very strong one.
And actually what's fascinating leading on from that and talking about the Cottesloe is that out of the Cottesloe and the Dorfman came these extraordinary commercial successes which on the face of them were not destined perhaps to be enormously commercial. Something like Warhorse, talking about people recreating the First World War using wooden horses on stage, or This House, or The Curious Incident of the Dog. A lot of very brave productions that actually on the face of them weren't obviously going to be commercial, but I mean some of them have toured the world for years, and all of those have had massively successful West End transfers. And that must have been very gratifying.
Very, very gratifying, and that is an absolute natural consequence of clearing the opportunities, clearing the repertoire, not doing the plushly cast revival that will delight the audience and please the award givers, and leaving space for things for a new play, new Polish play, or a new play by James Graham. Here's this guy who's 28, arrives in Nick's office and says, I'm very, very interested in the period of the 1970s, in 1970s politics between the Conservative. And you wouldn't necessarily have thought that was going to lead to a popular play, and indeed it did, and later revived in the West End. You can't, of course... We're touching upon something which I think is really interesting, which is you can analyse these things, and you can certainly analyse them afterwards. You can attribute almost everything to luck. And I think it's a good idea to have a good proportion of not being proud of oneself, but simply saying it's good luck. But luck isn't enough of an explanation, or certainly enough of a roadmap. So there's got to be some sense of what are the conditions that you can create in any theatre which tend towards fruitful experiment, fruitful risk-taking.
Yeah, and I think that those were extraordinary triumphs. And the show continues because obviously you rebuilt the Cottesloe and turned it into the Dorfman. You had the shed there as an enormously exciting temporary space. And then you and Nick have set up the London Theatre Company, and primarily you, have actually executed and built the first serious brand new theatre in London. Tell us about that, because extraordinary challenges, fascinating use of technology. I mean, what a great challenge.
A very, very enjoyable challenge, yes. It came from, because we started transferring our own shows into the West End, and we started getting uncomfortable with the amount of the receipts that flowed other than to people like Barney.
I know.
And the theatre was popular and has indeed grown in popularity by about 25% since over the last 15 years in London, which is quite extraordinary. But the commercial theatre is housed predominantly in late Victorian and Edwardian theatres. So it felt like there was an opportunity to add a new theatre into the mix, and if you could provide one which gave both the audiences and the artists better facilities, then that would seem like a wholly good thing to do. And we could, because it was not publicly funded, we could ask ourselves the question: what are the trade-offs? How do you make a room which appeals to actors and writers, that isn't formed like a cinema, where you would have exactly the same excellent sightline from each of the seats, but it would mean a lot of the seats were a long way away. So the answer is you make a courtyard form, and then by working with really the currently preeminent theatre architect Steve Tompkins and his design partner Roger Watts, could you provide a courtyard form and expand it up to 900,000 seats without the joy of it being lost, with offering comfort and still proximity? And that was the question we asked. And then in so doing, how much of that theatre could be adaptable so it could play either end stage or in the round or promenade, as we're doing for Julius Caesar, or in a thrust format, as we're doing for Barney's play Nightfall. And that's an enjoyable bringing together of a number of different things, bringing the architecture and obviously the economics of it. And underlying that is trying to create the circumstances in which, without subsidy, you could afford to take risks and do predominantly new stuff, because there's an underlying economic model, because by reinventing and starting with a blank page, and that's what we've embarked upon.
But it's a totally pleasurable experience, and I think one of the legacies that you've left behind the National Theatre was this commitment to people going there being a bookshop, there being nice bars, there being food at every level, including a very nice restaurant to eat at, all the food being produced on the premises. I mean, that eye for detail is incredibly important. I love the fact that when I went to see the Young Marks, there are no crisps or nuts on sale, so there's no crackling in the audience.
Drives you mad. You think, why does the management not? Why does the
crisps.
management? Why are they selling crisps? Exactly.
Brilliant. And you've got madeleines, which are incredibly tasty and very civilised and
very
silent.
quiet.
Absolutely silent.
And sparkling water on tap, which is the sign of a place of distinction, I think.
Now, we can't take credit for that.
Oh, really?
We're in a development which is what's called BREEAM Excellent.
Right.
Which is, I don't know what that acronym stands for, but it means that.
Really excellent.
It means environmental sustainability at the topmost level, which governs things like your waste disposal and the availability of tap water.
But it's a sort of inclusive space, because people are kind of welcomed into it. It's got almost the depths of a cave, but you've got all that very good, very sensibly priced food, so that almost sort of lures people in there at lunchtime. Tell us about the broader use, because it's not just plays you're having. You've got music, you've got Simon Russell Beale doing things. I mean, you've got quite a repertoire going on there.
Turns out the acoustic's very good. I mean, it was modelled to be good. And it should be good because you've got a relatively small space. And as you probably know, it's easy. You can take an acoustic from being, you can brighten an acoustic, but it's very hard to do the opposite. So we've been doing music and brightening the acoustic electronically a little. And our policy really is for Monday nights, is to do predominantly music and other things that delight us and entertain us. So we have a kind of policy of not having a policy. But Richard Thompson and so on have done very well there.
But you've got, your extraordinary use of very recently available technology in terms of the materials and the way that the stage is structured. Tell us about that, because it's cutting-edge science stuff, really, isn't it? Materials science.
Well, we thought if we were going to build a theatre, I think we got quickly to the idea that the only way of building it in the found space that we had come across at One Tower Bridge, it had already been constructed as a kind of big aircraft hangar sunk into the ground, that the only way we were going to be able to build in there was to use steel. And the good thing about steel is it gives you precision and it gives you a lot of strength for its thickness. So it means you can stack people vertically in comfort, and the sightlines can be particularly well judged. That meant that we could build it in a prefabricated form. So we built a London building in Norfolk, and then it came down in something like 57 pieces on the back of lorries, and then got posted in through a large garage door onto a monorail, slung into the space, dropped down, picked up by a big Tonka toy telehandler, and put into place like that. Actually, that turned out to be the only way of doing it, and we'd approached a big engineering company who they have a UK subsidiary. The American company is predominantly in rock gigs, and that's where the money is now, is in music. And they've refined a form of decking, staging, which they call magdeck, because parts of it are magnetic. And it goes up and comes down very quickly, and that's how we're managing to make the theatre so adaptable.
Very exciting, and I think also get a feeling that it's sort of embedding itself in the local community. It's a wonderful location right by Tower Bridge. You can go out at night and see an illuminated Tower of London opposite. I mean, you've got quite a nice location there.
It's a lovely location. I think, the thing we really hope to do, being in Southwark, is to play not just to the north of the borough. Obviously, our audience comes from right across London, particularly with the rebuilding of London Bridge Station, which brings its concourse closer to us, but also to the south of Southwark, which is because the borough is sort of long and thin, north to south. And so what we plan to do is some version of what we did at the National Theatre with Entry Pass, which is to make a long-term scheme for cheap tickets for young people. Because I think the one thing that you can do is just keep doing a scheme like that, because it ripples, because more and more people get to know about it, and you never know who you're going to catch in your net. So we no longer have the mission or the resources to have an education department like the National has, but there are sort of simple things we can do, I think, which indicate that we're there to stay.
No, definitely. Anybody going there would very clearly see that. And I think, do you think as a result of this experience, you perhaps feel that other theatres should be a bit bolder now in terms of rebuilding, because there are some theatres, perhaps not historic buildings, but old buildings that actually could get a new lease of life?
I do, actually, yeah, I do. I think the other thing is that people think that they want a new theatre or they want to refurbish a theatre. And what they don't do is to think, where have I seen one that's really, really, really good? And let's go and do that. There's particularly in the non-profit area, which is where building happens, actually. It happens almost never in the commercial area. I think there's you can understand it, that the donor doesn't want to think that it's been done elsewhere. They want to feel that they're getting outside a big, new, fancy building, possibly even from a star architect. And actually, I'd say the opposite of that. I think the thing that matters is the relationship between the actor and the audience. Mm-hmm. That has such a banal truth to it that, it ought to be the starting point. And that actually is a very hard thing to get right. And there's no reason why, as an architect, you'd be able to get that right from the first go. So you've probably designed a number of theatres. And you keep working, keep learning from mistakes.
Yeah. But in a way, you've very much simplified yours and Nick's life, because obviously with the National Theatre, you've got a large board of sort of external appointees, you've got trustees, you've got a large superstructure. Now, you've got, 8 founding investors and the people that work there. I mean, a much simpler structure. How have you found the transition from, if you like, the very large structure of the National Theatre down to something where effectively you and Nick can control everything?
I've found it less of a shift than I thought I would, actually, which might tell you something worrying about how we treated the board of the National Theatre. I think it's become harder and harder to run big subsidised organisations. I think the focus, the increasing number of imperatives which are imputed to these organisations has become very, very difficult. So I think our timing was probably quite good into have more freedom.
Definitely, and I think also speaking, well, myself and the other shareholders that I know, that there was very much a feeling that they shared your vision, and so they were financing you, but the direction and the decisions rested with you. So almost a sort of an ideal world where you had a set of investors who believed in your vision and were coming along, to enjoy the ride.
Oh, well, that's good. And since you are one of those investors, I'm very heartened by you saying that.
Well, but perhaps that's telling in itself. It is something you do well, and perhaps that's because you prioritise it, and we're talking about it this morning, and that's why it is impressive. And I think
you are the thing which is in shortest supply for us, and absolutely as it should be. And 15 years ago, the reverse was the case.
I think it's even more recent than that, and I think it's hugely encouraging because it seemed to me that finally we got this shift back from sort of preeminent director, preeminent actor, actually back to the words, and the words come from the writer, and I think it's sort of a long overdue shift back to sharing the acclaim in a more even-handed way, and the fact that we're being bombarded by a wide range of media, much of which is out of control. I mean, later this week I'm sitting down with Apple, and the first thing I shall say to them is talking about is social responsibility, because I think a lot of the social media networks and these big tech companies have absolutely no sense of social responsibility at all. They're all about profit, and there have been some ghastly things that have happened to people as a result. But I think now, what I'd like with the opportunities that you and Nick have is that you're able to do theatre that does ask some difficult questions. But I think if Barney went with a piece to Netflix or Amazon or Apple that was sort of questioning issues that those companies felt uncomfortable addressing, the work wouldn't get done. So I think the independent and the subsidised theatre is a vital spokespiece, way of getting a message out that isn't part of the machine. Does that resonate?
And it resonates as well. I wanted to pick up on what you said about simplification and about allowing there to be breadth in artistic perspective and view. What you said about having a policy of not having a policy, I think, again, is a very, as I understand it, watching from the outside, feels like a very deliberate and carefully sculpted and quite awe-inspiring at times thing, because I think you said in an interview that the artistic policy of the bridge would be good plays,
yes,
which is
right.
so sort of, and of course that's what, but it's really, you don't see it, and the clarity of that. And then it's a phrase I came across a lot in balancing acts of, I think more than one chapter ends with the phrase, a great night out, which is, and it's great, and the kind of simplicity of that, which I wonder may have partly felt like a very exciting opportunity after the politics of holding together all the things the National must be.
Yes, but I also want to say that's not what it felt like at the National.
Yeah.
Actually, I think maybe it can feel like that. I think we were lucky or clever or fortunate with our timing. I think probably it didn't feel as if there were two. That you had to do every now and then 18th century comedy. There would be things in the National that you had to do, but you'd do them from good faith and enthusiasm. But I think that I just came back, I spent last weekend in Berlin to try and get some movie rights. The rights to do on, the stage rights.
To stage a film, right, yeah.
Movie. Actually it was very interesting because the people I was talking to, small independent movie people who own themselves, found that we were absolutely on the same page. I was trying to explain what our policy, where we were coming from, and said, well, I guess we have a kind of fundamental belief that what is good can also be popular, and what is popular can also be good. And he said, yeah, exactly. He said, unlike the German theatre.
Right, okay.
And then, that evening I went to the Schaubühne to see, actually interesting, Thomas Ostermeyer directed production of a Yasmina Reza play. Thomas Ostermeyer, brilliant director, as you know. there is a very unfortunate schism in the German theatre, and I think in the French theatre too, which is, I think, in order to be good, you can't be popular.
Right.
I think there's a fundamental snobbishness about that. And luckily, it never happened in the British theatre.
It's interesting to hear it phrased as the BBC's governing document, or whatever that phrase is as well. And I wonder how remarkable, because actually just thinking about what you're saying there, I've grown up in a country where the main provider of culture existed to make the good popular and the popular good. That's and maybe that is a radical gesture. Maybe that is a radical statement that exists on these islands in a way that it doesn't elsewhere.
It's worth asking the question, though, isn't it? Because it's easy to take for granted that that is someone's mission. But there are so many pressures now that come through both, broadsheet commentary, but also social media. And there's such a little theatre bubble in which people are all talking to each other. And if you ever put your head into that bubble, gosh, you want to get your head out quickly, because it'll tell you all sorts of things which don't connect with any audience whatsoever.
Yes.
But it would be very, very easy to have your artistic policy very much influenced by that bubble.
It's very difficult not to, really. I think it takes great confidence to believe.
You're not in the bubble, though.
I don't know. I'm trying not to be.
Absolutely, by definition, you're not in the bubble.
Not in the bubble by definition. But yeah, it is such a complex set of interrelated. Well, it's like academia. It's just as frightening as academia, and the competitiveness of that. Although it's all under the surface. Oh, it's strange. Yeah.
You sort of get the feeling, don't you, sort of sometimes in opera, that the essential conversation that's going on, which is dictating what you see on the stages of the great opera houses and the less good opera houses around the world, is a conversation between about 10 or 12 intendants.
Yes. Who were all at the same party in 1928 and are still
and they're slightly
arguing
competing. I've managed to get so-and-so, and, sort of, who's got the latest Ivo van Hove production, and... you think, yeah, it's great. Of course, that edge and competitiveness and feeling of where the leading edge is, where the avant-garde might be, is good. But you don't want to lose the dialogue with an audience.
Well, you've never shied away from doing. If you look at your two novels, you've never shied away from difficult subjects that aren't clearly part of the mainstream. And if one did a synopsis of your two novels, they're not the sort of thing that would have the guys at Amazon or Netflix foaming at the mouth to do them.
Alas, not yet.
No, but that's a good thing, Barney, in my book, because you've written them because you needed to write them, you wanted to write them, not because you had a commercial objective in doing so. If you wanted to write a multi-bestseller, no doubt you could have done, but it wouldn't have been the books that you've written. And,
but I like
maybe that's what Nick's picked. That the two Nicks are picked up on, for your work for the theatre.
And I like this idea as well that the greatest successes, impossible definition, but some obvious successes of the National Theatre while you were running it. Had in common that they were not obvious, and also that there were none set in London. I thought this was a lovely thing. The longest running West End shows were never set in London, and they were new work that happened and that was sort of workshopped in the studio. And Warhorse and The Curious Incident, The Dog in the Night Time, don't look. I mean, obviously, Curious Incident had been this. Both of them had been great, successful books, but nonetheless,
not Warhorse.
Had it not at that time? No. Sorry. Okay. No. Sorry.
But Curious Incident
had been this big hit, but all the same, even with that success, you don't immediately go, well, that'll be a brilliant play, that'll work, but that's exactly the consequence of what you mentioned earlier, which was just clearing a way for, and this house again, clearing a way for, which is set in London, for things to grow and to be. To take their own philosophy and to happen within an umbrella that's actually pretty accommodating.
Obviously, we think a lot about what Warhorse and Curious Incident have common, if that's at all useful. And of course, I wonder, what do you think about this? I wonder whether the bigger the formal gap between the starting material and how it would be on the stage, the better. That films tend to look for things that when you read them, if it's a novel, let's say,
You can see it.
you could see it. You could. So then that's a snare and a delusion for the theatre, because if the films become well known, you don't just want to put it on stage because it wants to ask the question, why is this a play? So
Which is perhaps why Jane Austen is so often badly done, because it suggests itself so
I think that's
immediately.
absolutely right. Whether for that reason, I don't know. But I'm just wondering, a story told by a horse is going to be such a big formal challenge. A story told in the first person singular of a 15-year-old child on the spectrum is going to be tricky.
And therefore, there's some kind of excitement to get your teeth into, and that's why.
And therefore, if Simon Stevens is going to manage that, he's had to invent a lot. And obviously, the big thing the stage gives you is it immediately gives you other people's points of view, doesn't it? It gives you instant empathy, just like it gives you instant dramatic irony. I mean, it's good for things like that.
Because you say, when you hear there's going to be a play about the Curious Incident, so just can't imagine what that's going to be like. And that I can't imagine.
That's got to be good, hasn't it?
That
I mean, it might be
great.
terrible, which is why it's a good idea to have something like the National Theatre Studio, to have some way in which you won't just march on down a path, which is probably another reason why famous titles are also difficult, that actually maybe it's not helpful to having a famous title, because it's going to impel you just to take the next step, where sometimes you should just say, it actually hasn't worked and we should stop.
Yeah, a lot of those books that you live with, from your undergraduate English days, you have your own vision, and almost going and seeing a play is going to irritate you by definition, because you're going to have to unpack a lot of the mental furniture you've got in place about what that play is really about, what that book's really about, and then turning it into a play kind of interferes with a lot of your critical apparatus. So I think I can see that, but I think that hopefully that doesn't stop either of you reaching out to challenge the audience, and because I think challenging the audience is something you both do well, and it's something that all too easily in the commercial theatre you get almost people thinking, well, how can I make lots of money? How can something's been successful? Let me write something like that. And do you ever get people coming along saying, this has been very successful?
Oh, sure, yeah, sure, yes,
Me
absolutely.
too. And that's a disaster, isn't it?
I think it is a disaster. For the simple pragmatic reasons, I just don't think it ever works, does it?
Doesn't film.
It doesn't film, exactly. It
Right.
doesn't
Well,
film.
part 2, part 3.
Yeah,
I mean, we've never tried the sequel in the theatre, so that's...
Thank goodness.
Peace Horse.
I could imagine that. But
Could be good.
Could you?
Peace Horse. He goes back to, it's another generation.
really, really boring,
Yes.
unathletic
Yeah.
life in a desert village.
And it's turned into glue at the end. Or it's just the story of some glue remembering. That could be
that's
good.
very good. Yeah, we used to fantasise that possibly on the last performance of Warhorse, the gun would go off.
But if somebody came along to you, Barney, and said, I love Ferryman, write Ferryman Part 2, you wouldn't go near it,
I'd
would you?
hope you'd
No.
stand around the fact.
Yeah, that's. Although I do feel uncomfortable, you picked on one I'm afraid of. I'm always afraid of. I felt so frustrated because this book I've got coming out in January is a troubled story. Well, indeed, it's a Jean McConville story. It's a disappeared story at some level.
Yeah.
Jez Butterworth always nicks my ideas. He's got my email address and he's logging in and he's seeing what I'm doing, and it's horrible.
No, because I think what you've got is an extraordinary juxtaposition of the sort of the macro setting of the Irish Trouble, which is like there in the background, like a nightmare you've had, and you're hoping that it was sort of, you've moved on, it wasn't all real, and you sort of hopefully got over some of the shock of it. And then there's the intensely personal level of issues and the dynamics of a family relationship and relationships. And I think The Ferryman would not be a book. What you've written, I think, is a really, really good novel.
I agree, it's a masterpiece.
How
you need to read this.
Yes, yeah.
You should have one, hopefully.
You've sent me one.
Good.
Right, I'm very much looking forward to it. How do you know instantly whether something is a novel or a play? Is that even a question in your mind?
So far I have. I think the simple thing is that you need, yes, it's such a different amount of material. I've tried to ask, because I don't know the answer, but I've tried to talk. I was talking to Michael Frayn the other week about this, about how he can identify, how is it expressing it. I talked to Sebastian Barry about it, and I don't think he's very sort of, well, it just sort of, you just sort of write it and that's it. And then Michael Frayn, you do get the sense of a kind of mathematical understanding. He's such an extraordinarily intelligent man, that you really do. And he told the story of how he came up with the plot of Headlong, which was amazing, which he, while looking at a painting in a sort of half second, had the whole plot, which was amazing, really brilliant to hear. But I don't know, really. I just think it's really the conversation either starts with someone who's going to pay you who works in books, or someone who's going to pay you who works in plays at the moment, and then you go a little bit, but I think up to a point, and then you do it differently, and a story would grow differently, but I don't always know in great detail what I'm going to do, really, so
that conversation is useful?
It's formative, because then the geometry of stage or the geometry of fiction immediately takes over, and you grow a story in a different way, and the way metaphor would play out and the way time happens and all that shapes it suddenly, and you see a stage or you don't. But that initiating thing, I have done one for no one, but it was going to be a play. I had an idea for a play because it was a play, so that was different.
Because you have your own company.
Yes, so those are, and again, but that's because, well, we better do another one.
Yes.
Because no one will book this one anymore. So let's go on.
I love the simple pragmatism of
that's great. I think that's, we must have apples to sell. Quick, plant an apple tree.
yes.
And that's the, at the moment. But I'm sure given time, I will be able to get a philosophy together that serves more. But to date, it's just,
I love the simple practicality of that.
I quite like it. I think it's, well, and that's what I like so much about the Bridge and being associated with that, because there is something very reassuring about being told you don't need more than that. Try and do something good. That would be great if you could be good. And in very few places is that the case. As you say, in the subsidised sector, I think in very few places is that the case. There is a great deal of politics around what a play is wherever you go, and that's great and that's important, but it can be quite difficult to maintain your own thoughts in amongst it all, I think. I don't know.
Do you ever, when you're writing a novel, do you ever get to a point where you think, oh my God, it's a short story, it's finished after 30 pages or 20 pages?
I think they all are. Everything is, you get to 25,000 words, you think, well, that's done. I've better not give the contract back, so we'll go. But because it's just slog, and it's. But Nightfall was a 15,000 word play, and I think everything I've done plays-wise comes out 14.5 or 15. But then under Nick's supervision and then Laurie's supervision, that's become 21, 22, 20 and a half, I can't remember. I know for a bit it was too long. It was 24, and that's too long. And, but that happened because other people who had thinking more practically about how the night will go are saying, could the second half last more than 20 minutes, or whatever, and that metaphor hasn't been unfolded or whatever.
Do you ever get told, this play, sorry, we haven't got time for an interval, so it's just got to go whoosh the whole way through?
Well, that was the first idea with Nightfall. I remember Nick's first idea was of a play without an interval. And it just kind of fell out that didn't give... Well, the story, I think when you backed the play, it was still kind of a first half and then a scene that was obviously a holding scene, if you know what I mean, like wasn't a play yet. And so that second half, by virtue of not existing, could have been anything. And then at some point it became, actually, we need a bit more time than just a three-act structure allows. We need these two for the story to play out so that the characters all get something to say. I think that happened kind of later. But yeah, it was a first idea, so which I appreciated, because usually theatres will tell you the precise opposite, because it really impacts on the gin sales, and you lose a lot by not having an interval.
You do, there's quite high financial penalties for the producer not to have a
put an interval in.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was lovely if that could have, but actually it became appropriate, I think.
I think, absolutely.
Unless there's another rewrite to come.
No, very appropriate, I think.
Yeah.
What about ice cream in the theatre and the interval? Is that acceptable?
Oh, very much so, yes. We've got a very carefully sourced ice cream that we sell in the foyer, yeah.
Excellent.
So
I didn't find it.
I haven't had the ice
I think that's
cream
from
yet.
Norfolk. It's very, very good, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
I think in the summer that's
It's a major plank in theatre economics, actually, ice creams.
Is it?
For real, it really is, yeah.
Oh, that's
It goes right through the winter as well. It's a myth to think people don't buy them in the winter, they do.
Oh, well, I've learnt many things today, but I didn't expect to learn something about one of my passions, which is ice cream. So. Thank you guys very much for that. I guess we should pull up stumps there and get a cup of coffee and
Great.
and catch up and go and see what's emerged.